This is the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry, brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast. My name's Andrew Jones and with me today is...
Sarah Bolt.
How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm really good, thank you. And you, Andrew?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. We have got what I hope is a really interesting podcast for people today. I've got to be honest with you. After we recorded this, I went downstairs and saw my other half and said, I think this is possibly the most important podcast I've recorded in nearly the 3 years I've been doing this.
Yeah, I think TB is such an emotive subject, isn't it?
Yes.
The impact it has on people and businesses, I think, is where it all stems from, isn't it?
We need to stress a couple of things. One, yes, the very emotive. So if you need help, please reach out to someone like FCN or any of those sorts of things, or even just ring your mates and talk to them, because this does add a lot of stress to people. This advice is from TBAS England, so this is advice relative to England. If you're in other parts of the country or world, obviously speak to your local veterinary advice regarding TB. But it has definitely thrown up an interesting question, hasn't it, Sarah?
It has. Do you want to tell us about it, Andrew?
Well, my other half, being a nurse, said to me, she said, is bovine TB still a public health issue? And having listened back through the podcast with our guest, it was, yes, it is. And she's like, well, we don't, and I hadn't realised this, and I guess you're like me, of that generation, as much as I hate to say it now, Sarah, for the pair of us, of that generation that remembers the 7 needles and being tested for TB and then having the vaccine. It's not a routine vaccination anymore. So I went back to our guest and I asked our guest, in that case, should people, because you'll see she mentions in there that the people most at risk, most likely to suffer if there is a TB breakdown, is people on farms, vets, and people in abattoirs. And asked the question is, should we therefore on farm, maybe part of our induction or risk assessment, be considering that all our staff should be vaccinated for TB?
It's an interesting one, isn't it?
It is. And I asked our guest this, and she came back to me and said, it's a bit more complicated than that. Yes, according to Public Health England, that is what should happen. But she said she had experiences of her own and friends and that in the veterinary profession had struggled to get TB tests or to get the vaccination. And I know you and I both looked at it a little bit, okay, only in passing, because I know this has only sort of cropped up the last 24 hours as we record this, and we both been busy with other things. But it looks like it is, and well, it looks like it's possibly something you're going to have to pay for yourself if you want it. But is it something that we need as an industry to be looking at to ensure that everyone on farm, because they mentioned vets, okay, great, but people on farm just as much need to ensure that people have got that TB vaccination, because it certainly looks like anybody 40, 45 and under probably wasn't vaccinated.
Yeah. And you think that all these other zoonotic like lepto and that kind of thing, we're all encouraged to, or farmers are all encouraged to make sure they vaccinate their cows to protect their staff. So it is another interesting thing to actually think about, isn't it? Well,
it is. It's I don't know. I suppose, like always with these podcasts, hopefully it creates maybe some debate in the industries to is this something we as an industry need to be looking at, that on farm we should ensure that everybody is vaccinated for TB, because they're potentially risk. I mean, the risk is very small, but the last thing you want to be is the person that either had it or were the employer of somebody that's got it, I would suggest. So
yeah.
So anyway, just a thought to leave with you all before we get on today. So our topic today is the TB advisory service. This podcast has been brought to you today by Chewing the Cud Limited, who offer independent advice for dairy and beef nutrition. cow signals advice and training, along with ROMS mobility scoring. For more details on these and other services available, please visit our website www.chewingthecud.com or email us direct on nutrition@chewingthecud.com. Hello and welcome to Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast for the UK dairy industry. Farmer, advisor, processor, and everyone else, we have topics and episodes that will interest you. We discuss the practical and the technical aspects of different UK dairy industry topics. We aim to make you think about what you're doing and ask yourself, can it be done differently? Listen to us speak with specialists from inside and outside the industry about their area of expertise. Subscribe and listen to episodes for free on your favourite podcast platform or sign up on our website www.chewingthecud.com for podcast notifications so you never miss an episode and links to our socials, including our Instagram, Chewing the Cud Podcast. All one word and remember no G. Or email us direct on podcast@chewingthecud.com. If you like what we do, please share and leave us a review to show your support. And that's it. Enjoy today's episode. So hello and welcome back to Chewing the Cud podcast. And with us today is our guest, Sarah Tomlinson from the TB Advisory Service. Morning, Sarah.
Good morning.
Sorry, it's getting very confusing. I've got two Sarahs in front of me before. I've had two Neils in the past and now I've got two Sarahs. So if you get a bit confused listening, apologies to everybody. So anyway, Sarah, we're here to talk about your role in the TB Advisory Service. But first, let's tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Thank you. So fundamentally, I'm a farm vet. I've been in practice since 2001 when I graduated in lovely Derbyshire. I've been privileged to work with some of the same farmers for most of my career. And I suppose I saw TB get worse in Derbyshire. We were on 4 yearly testing. In 2018, we went on to 6 monthly testing. And I was part of the community. Farmers were asking questions. I realised how impactful TB was to their everyday lives. So I made it my job, I suppose, to find out more about it, because traditionally vets don't talk about TB. We go and do the testing, but actually we don't get to decide what tests or when, or even interpret the results. So I made it my job to go out and find more and to be able to share that with my clients. And then through that, I applied for a role on the TB Eradication Advisory Group for England. And that was, bless her, one of my farmers' wives who really encouraged me to do that. I said, you know what, I'm just a farm vet. And they went, but that's what they need to hear from.
Yes, they want someone on the ground.
Yeah, so I got an interview in London and told them what I knew and got a position on that group. And that massively opened my eyes to the role that government and DEFRA play in TB control, and that actually it's not, they haven't got an easy job either. So I think I've got a really good knowledge across from the top, the politics, the decisions that have to be made up there. But equally, I think I still have got that understanding from a sort of grassroots level. And I enjoy talking to farmers about TB because nobody's ever done that before, I don't think, and explaining it as an infectious disease, because I think farmers and vets are really good at talking about infectious disease control. So why not TB?
And I think, as you've said, you've said before we've recorded this, it's a very emotive subject. Now, I can remember having TB as a kid, teenager, about the same time I'd have had the 7 needles in my arm. If people still get them, I don't know. Yep. But I mean, so that's going back 35 years ago, and it was all very hush hush. You didn't tell anybody, but you now almost expect people to have it, if they haven't got it, to have had it not long ago. And timing, you'd argue isn't good for some reasons, but funny enough, yesterday I ran into some old college friends just talking to them, as you say, the emotional impact it's had on them simply from having we'll get to the gamma later on, but I mean, they've had one lesion found, so they've had to gamma test, and they're now being told that by the time this podcast goes out, they'll lost a quarter of their herd. And that's a massive impact on any business, and not just business, it's the emotional side of it, isn't it, as well?
It is. And that's why I suppose I like doing what I do, because I do feel understanding the science and evidence and why we have the policies we have can help understand why we do what we do. And the TB advisory service in particular actually is something positive that farmers and vets can do around TB. It is, we have armed a lot of private vets with the confidence to be able to go out on farm and say, right, this is horrible. What can I do to help you? How do we reduce the length of your breakdown by working together? And how do we prevent or reduce the risk of the next breakdown through just really, really simple stuff? You know, where are the risks and what can we do to mitigate them?
Exactly, because all you hear on farm is inconsistency, I would say, between advice or who depends who you seem to talk to. So it's really good that there is a focal point to maybe try and get a clear message out as to the good, bad and indifferent of TB.
We try really hard to sort of park the politics. I'm really happy to talk about that. And a lot of vets now are, again, can talk about that. But I think for me, it's what can farmers do today, tomorrow, next week on their own farm to reduce their risk. You know, leave the NFUs, the BCVAs, the sort of lobbying groups to try and change policy to make it slightly less painful for farmers. But actually at a farm level, we need to give farmers a little bit of control back. And I do think that's what the TB advisory service does.
Yeah.
So sort of sorry, I'm talking over there.
Go on,
so sort of taking a step back to sort of tell us a bit about the TB advisory service, sort of how it came about, how long it's been around, and how that helps vets work with their farmer clients.
Yep, so it is DEFRA funded, and we do talk about policy and, you know, what people can and can't do, but it is delivered in the most by farms' own private vets, which I think is good because it has given the vets something positive to do around TB, but also they're farmers' trusted advisors. And I'd like to think farmers and vets do work really well together. They know the business, they know the people. So we talk about really bespoke recommendations. And that's why it's really hard when I do things like this to talk about, we could advise this and advise that, because it's very easy for farmers to go, well, I can't do that. So it is really an individual visit to talk about what you can do to reduce those risks.
But it's giving some practical advice, isn't it? As you say, that the farmer, being the farm vet, as you say, you know the farm, so you can go and bespoke the advice to that particular client and that particular farming situation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions we encourage the advisors to ask is, you know, what are your plans for the next 5 years on this unit? Private vets might know that already, because if farmers are wanting to expand and they're buying cattle in, that's the first risk we can talk about managing. If they are wanting to take on new bits of ground, where's the risk from a TB point of view? So we can show them the IBTB map where you can see every breakdown herd in England and Wales going back 10 years. So there is really practical tools out there that can help farmers.
Okay.
I think what I like about it is that it gives the farm vet an opportunity to talk about TB. Often it's not the farm vet themselves that are out doing the TB testing and dealing with any outcomes at that time. So it actually gives them an opportunity to go on farm and actually talk about it. And I think that's what's really nice about the whole process.
Yeah, and and actually about 75% of our visits are to farms that don't have TB. So it is a really proactive tool. Yes, absolutely. When people go down with TB and they're suffering with that devastation, what do I do? What can I do? We can be there for that. But actually, you know, the most time to do the visit is probably when you've just come off restrictions and you're going, yay, actually, cold light of day. How do we stop the next one?
To limit future impact, basically.
Yeah. And there was a recent FCM report came out a couple of weeks ago, and Farm Community Network, a charity that works really closely with farmers and supports them and can help, go through all the paperwork and the devastation that TB causes. Really, really useful local resource. They did a report over a couple of summers ago. They did a big survey looking at the mental health and the impacts TB has on farmers. And their conclusion was it's not the disease that's the problem, like BVD, like lameness, like mastitis. It's the control measures. So it is preventing that next breakdown that is key. The issue we do have with the TB advisory service, and I've done a couple of meetings just this week with farmers slightly in the low risk area and the edge area where they might not have had TB. And actually, how do you persuade those people? Let's look at what my risks are. Let's mitigate them. Let's have an insurance policy and hope I never get it. So I would urge any farmer, even if you think, well, I'm never going to get TB, just have a TBAS visit. They are only available in England, but in Wales, they do have the Cymorth TB service as well. So they can speak to their vets about that.
So taking a step back, TB, what is it? What impact does it have? I suppose we don't hear about it much in public health these days, but I mean, tell us a little bit about more the disease.
No, so originally bovine TB was one of the biggest killers of humans in the UK. And actually pre-COVID, it was still the biggest infectious disease killer of humans. So worldwide, So it is still a public health issue in other countries.
Yep.
We started in the 1920s, 1930s to look at those risk factors from a public health point of view. And anybody that's watched the recent James Herriot series or read the books, they focused on this introduction of a testing herds. So there was that voluntary scheme to go out and TB test your herds. Interestingly enough, farmers were paid, and I've got it in front of me now, a penny a gallon on their milk if they were in a tested herd, and they were paid £1 an animal for beef herds every year. So there was a really good financial incentive for
to be tested, to be voluntarily tested.
Yeah, and then milk was able to be marketed as TB from TB-free herds.
Yeah.
Then we introduced pasteurisation. That became the norm, and again, it was labelled as pasteurised milk. Then we got the vaccination programs that were introduced sort of around the 1950s. And actually, it was only stopped. Sorry.
As in TB vaccination?
Yes, so that was what you were talking about at the minute. You got your little test, and then a couple of days later, if you hadn't reacted, you got your big jab in the arm.
Yeah.
So a combination of measures, testing the cows, reducing the risk from milk, vaccinating humans, actually, as we've succeeded. TB is no longer a big issue in humans. However, we don't routinely vaccinate people now. I had a phone call the other day from a guy who was selling raw milk. He'd just gone down with TB. What could he do? So there's a cohort of young people, farmers, vets, slaughtermen, to pretend initially that there could still be a risk. And I would argue that what we're doing is holding that at bay. It is still part of the process.
That reminds me actually of a farm I used to relief milk for. I think they were going to put in raw milk, bottled, and they went down with TB. So in the end, they changed it and pasteurised and obviously all different. But that was their original plan. And I just hadn't you've just reminded me of that from what you've just said.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, though, because farmers say, well, if it's not a public health issue, why are we still doing what we're doing? We have to apply by certain rules to allow access for trade. And again, some farmers say, well, I don't trade internationally. Why does it bother me? But that allows the prices that we've got in this country. It does allow exports of dairy products. That fifth quarter, it adds a huge amount of value onto our carcasses. I learnt the other day that parts of a dairy cull cow are exported to 26 different countries. So it's farmers sort of thinking that actually we have to do some of these things to allow our businesses to continue and to trade. So it is important because of that public health risk in those other countries, if you see what I mean. There is a bigger picture to this.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of my experience in Oz. I mean, having farmed in Australia for 10 years, I think Australia is officially TB free. But I remember our vets in North Queensland said they used to have the contract for the whole of North Queensland. So the vet practice had, I think, was it 5 light planes, and the vets knew could fly, and they used to literally fly all over the whole of the northern Queensland to do TB testing back in about the 80s or something, and got to that stage.
And interestingly, because a lot of farmers in the UK do sort of champion New Zealand and Australian on their control measures for TB. However, in Australia, I think their control measures did destroy quite a lot of the industry, and they use bovine only. So we use a comparative test for the avian and the bovine in the UK. And I believe if they had one bovine positive in a cattle lot of thousands of head of cattle, they took the whole lot. So we need to be careful what we wish for in this country. Some people would argue we're not hard enough and maybe we should be doing it to stamp it out. Other businesses would argue that I don't want to lose all these cows. It's bad enough when I have a gamma test. And again, I'm not defending DEFRA and government, but that is the balance that they have to pay. You know, everybody's business is different, and how we control it impacts businesses differently.
Well, how do we compare to other countries in terms of TB? So, in terms, like you mentioned Australia and New Zealand, but I mean, you don't hear other countries testing for TB in the way that we do.
So we do have the highest levels of bovine TB in Europe. A couple of reasons. One is that other European countries, I think we're one of the only ones that uses the comparative test, which is less sensitive, and we can talk about that. So they use the bovine only, which is a lot harder. They'll probably take out a lot of cattle that are false positives.
Yep.
And they do routinely, around TB breakdowns, control the wildlife, which we haven't traditionally done until sort of 2013, 14, 15 in this country.
Well, yeah, I know I've met a few Americans in the past, and they can't believe the how do we put it, restrictions on controlling wildlife that we have to deal with. They're like, oh, we have a problem, we just go out and shoot it. It's like, no, can't do that.
Yeah. Although, ironically, in parts of America, especially around Michigan, their wildlife reservoir was white-tailed deer, and they didn't want to control those on a large scale for the absolutely opposite reason of why we don't want to control badgers, is because actually Michigan is a very hunting, shooting, fishing state, and they want to hunt them. And actually they were causing worse issues with TB because they were feeding these white-tailed deer in sort of over winter to allow them to become easier to shoot for the people that came from the cities to do it. And that was causing TB to spread within the deer. So each country does have its issues, but we do have the highest levels of bovine TB in Europe.
So I don't know if this is the right time to ask, why do you think TB has increased? I mean, certainly here in the Southwest, as I mentioned, 35 years ago when we had it, I remember getting a talking to from my parents, you don't mention this. This is very hush hush, whereas now, I mean, I came back from Oz, that's nearly 16 years. No, it is 16 years ago now. And it's all of a sudden everybody, and I remember meeting people who we've never had it before. Now we've got it, and they just didn't know what to do.
Yeah, and it's through a combination of issues, really. So around the 1960s, 70s, because of the attestation of herds, and it did become basically, if you weren't attested, you were put under movement restrictions and couldn't trade. So the stick bit came later. There was the incentives initially, and we had got it to really, really low levels. The industry was very different. We had smaller herds, there's less trade. So there's a lot of trade that cattle move a lot further now. And then we had slight changes to policy. So we went on to 4-yearly testing. Wildlife were identified as a reservoir, and actually badger culling was initiated and started in the 70s, 80s, and actually was carrying on into the 1990s. But we were seeing TB rise really slightly. And then in 2001, which is the year I graduated, we suspended TB testing because of foot and mouth controls.
I remember that.
And
I wasn't here, so I remember, hearing about TB and thinking, God, I'm glad I'm not there. But I hadn't realised that had affected on the TB as well.
Yeah, because actually the TB testing that we do regularly, taking out those infected animals, was controlling it. Yeah. And so we stopped TB testing, so we weren't taking out the infected animals from herds, and we allowed farmers to trade, and there was a lot of relocation of animals, restocking, post foot and mouth. So that if you look at the graphs of TB, that's when we saw a massive jump. It nearly trebled, if not quadrupled, the level of TB we had. And it just started.
How long a period did you not TB test?
I think it was nearly 2 years, sort of, a good year, 18 months. But if people had missed their 4 yearly testing in that period, and definitely in Derbyshire when I started, there were parishes that were on 4 yearly testing, that just got skipped. So that did cause it to jump, and then it just became slightly uncontrollable. What I suspect is that cattle were traded, even though farms were officially TB free and infected animals were traded. It seeped into wildlife, became, endemic in wildlife populations, and grew and grew and grew till its most sort of around the 2010, 2012s. And actually, that's when government said, what do we do about this? And we got the 25-year eradication strategy.
Am I right in thinking, though, that levels are now back down to below what they were when foot and mouth outbreak? Is that right?
Yeah, so we've got the lowest levels in England we've had for 20 years. They have come down quite significantly and look like they are heading the right way. So we're back down to, levels just post foot and mouth, not quite pre foot and mouth yet. But we are winning, and that is a massive positive. You talked earlier about the mental health impacts of TB and just the stress and anxiety it causes. I think we're missing that good news. We are at the lowest levels we've had for 20 years in England, and Wales.
I've not heard that, so that is really positive.
Yeah, and that's a combination of things. Yes, culling badgers where they were endemically infected and were causing new breakdowns in cattle herds. We've gone in with 6 monthly testing. So if you look more, you're going to find more. We use gamma, which you talked about earlier, which is more sensitive, does take more animals. You're right. I normally advise farmers to expect to lose 5 to 10% of their herd, but they remove animals earlier, and they're the future reactors. It's a more sensitive test, so we miss less. And so it's hard. I get that. It is hard on the business, but we've got to think that is partly why we are reducing TB.
But that reservoir of infection is reduced in that way then, isn't it? If you're taking them out earlier, that reservoir is reducing and spread is.
And going back to the TB advisory service, one of the big things that I think the vets have realised, and we're encouraging them to do, is actually start to manage the high risk animals before you get the next breakdown. Hopefully you don't get the next breakdown. So TB and Yonies are Mycobacterium. They're exactly the same family. So all the things we know about Yonies, we can probably assume TB acts in the same way. So just like with Yonies, we do milk testing, we identify a positive animal, antibody positive animal. It can be fit and healthy, but we remove them out the herd. We proactively cull them because we know there's a high chance it can spread Yonies to its offspring through colostrum, through the uterus, and also if it is shedding intermittently through feces. So, but what we don't do, we cull that red animal, but we also look at where her daughters are, or where, any mother, granddam and mothers are, because we know it comes down family lines. We know it is transmitted vertically. TB, we should be doing the same. So when you lose a reactor, let's look at daughters of that reactor, mothers of that reactor, and actually can we proactively remove those from the herd? The other thing we can do is what they do in Europe, is do the bovine only interpretation. So we can ignore the avian lump and go, right, these animals are probably higher risk. You don't have to cull them all, because some of them will be false positives. But actually, if it's a mother or a daughter, or was in a heifer cohort that grazed an infected paddock, let's start to proactively cull those out before we get the next breakdown. And I think that's the kind of light bulb moment that I've had. And I think quite a lot of vets in practice are having now, is let's treat this like Yonies and start to manage it before we get the next breakdown.
How many false positives can you get?
Oh, I don't know. And I don't. The problem is because we kill every positive on the skin test, we don't know. So with Yoni's cattle, we know that, we see them progress through the herd, don't we, if you don't take them out as red cattle. So you do eventually see those tests going up and up and up and up. I would There probably is some papers out there that do say that. If there isn't, maybe that is research that somebody needs to do, because we do need to know, are we killing the right animals? I'd say if they were a mother or a daughter, or you've already lost 10 heifers out of a group of 25, they are high risk animals, and it's about that risk assessment and what you can do about it.
As you say, it's not just I say we've already mentioned the emotive and the impact, but for people that aren't on farm, don't realise, like if you're on a 60-day test, that's effectively a week every 2 months is out. Just TB testing, the extra workload that creates, and the stress and everything else that goes with it. It has a big impact on the farm if you're shut down with TB.
It absolutely does. And, you know, farmers are trying to run good businesses. They're trying to be more efficient, increase their productivity. That then we know reduces antimicrobial use, reduces their carbon footprint. They can think about investing in their future. While they're struggling with TB, all of that goes out the window. You know, farmers haven't got the mental or physical capacity or financial capacity to think beyond, you know, the next test. And that's what's hard about TB.
And I know I was having a brief discussion with someone on LinkedIn not too long ago, and he was sort of saying, farmers keep too many replacements, it's not good on carbon footprint, et cetera. And I sort of rebuffed him, I guess is probably the right way to say that, you know, I get it and I'm in completely agreement with him, but a lot of farms will keep extra replacements because they just never know TB. You know, we might suddenly lose 5 or we might lose 10, but we just want to make sure we've got plenty coming through in case that situation arises. So you could argue it's the whole TB impacts carbon footprinting, all of these things on the farm.
From a dairy farmer point of view, really you should be putting sex semen in the top cows to get your best heifers for your replacements. The rest go to dairy beef, and that's a co-product that should be profitable as well from that side of the business. But you're absolutely right. You know, we're diluting the genetic pool, if you like, as well, because you haven't got that cohort of really specific animals that you can breed from, because you need that insurance policy.
Since we're talking genetics, can I mention the TB Advantage, because that's quite a new one out, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there is a genetic, I suppose, advantage to not getting TB, just like there is for lots of things, isn't there? I was a bit sceptical when it first came out, and I spoke to the people that developed it that, you know, are we just picking animals that are from low risk areas? Because we know people have different sort of favourite bulls that are in geographical locations. Are we selecting animals that just don't respond to the skin test? Because we wouldn't want that either. And they reassure me that no, they've looked at, you know, so many data sets over years that this is it is a specific advantage. I don't believe there's any negative bulls on the market, but there are some that are more positive than others. So my advice is, you know, pick your bulls for whatever reason you want to pick them, and then if you're between 2 or 3, pick the one that has the most positive TB Advantage score.
So going back, we sort of spoke about where it came from. So you were saying about the difference between the different tests.
Yes.
In terms of, was it bovine only and bovine avian and what, where, how, what, I guess?
Yeah. So we use the comparative skin test, or some people call it the SICKIT test. And that's very specific part on the neck, 2 clip marks. We measure the skin, because that's really important, because we're measuring a difference in the thickness on day 2. We inject avian tuberculin and bovine tuberculin, and when 72 hours later, plus or minus 4 hours, so if you do your test on a Monday morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, you shouldn't be reading it on a Thursday evening. We do need to
if you
be specific.
You always do them first.
Yes.
Sort of.
And then the skin is measured, felt for a reaction, and then measured on day 2. And it's that difference in the skin thickness that we're looking for. And sort of as a rule of thumb, as long as the avian lump is bigger than the bottom lump, the bovine lump, we see that as just a reaction to mycobacterium that's in the environment. So it's like a control, if you like.
Yeah.
The skin test, and this is the key thing, if nobody else listens to any other part of this podcast and doesn't remember anything, the skin test is really, really specific. And the specificity of a test is the probability that we correctly identify a truly infected animal. So the probability of the skin test is 99.98%. That is one of the most specific tests we have in animal health. You know, the Yonis test isn't that specific. The BVD test isn't. We need to trust the skin test that when we get a reactor, we are 99.98% certain that animal is infected. What it doesn't tell us is how infectious it is, so how much it's spreading the disease, and how diseased it is. So when it goes to slaughter, the good news is if it hasn't got lesions, it's probably less infectious and we've caught it earlier.
Yeah.
And when animals go to slaughter as reactors, they are put through a sort of, albeit a slowed, commercial slaughter line. And most people will know how big a set of cow lungs are. You know, you couldn't get your arms around them. They are felt. There's a couple of knife cuts into them. So if you've got a lesion the size of an apple, which has been there longer, more infectious, you're more likely to find it. But if you've got a lesion the size of a pea or smaller, the results will be no visible lesions.
And I think this is something that's really important, isn't it? So how many farmers do we speak to and they go, oh, and all of these were sent away and most of them came back with no visible lesions. And I think it's a really...
And they didn't have it.
Yes. So we then make that assumption that they didn't have it. And I think that this is, as you said, the most important part to get across, that the test is so specific.
Yeah.
It will have it.
Yeah.
It's just that we didn't find it in the PM.
Yeah, and it's really important it's specific, because we kill every positive and we put people under movement restrictions, which are harsh. So we need to be really confident that we are, you know, doing that for the right reasons. The opposite of the specificity, though, is the sensitivity. So it's sort of two sides of a balance. And the sensitivity is almost the probability of finding all of the positive animals. And we know with the skin test, done properly on a good day, is about 80% sensitive. So that means that about 20% of animals are testing clear, but actually they're false negatives. They are infected animals. So we're missing 1 in 5 infected animals. And again, that's why you put under movement restrictions, because we know even with one reactor, there's likely to be more. And so that's why we repeat the test. And that's why sometimes we go in with the gamma test, because that is more sensitive. Still can miss 1 in 10. It's only about 90% sensitive. So it's not perfect. But if you do both the skin test and the gamma test at a similar time, hopefully they miss fewer animals both together and you go clearer quicker and for longer.
So why do we do the bovine avian where you say other countries just do the bovine test?
Because I think we've got we're not at a level of infection within the country to be able to do that, I think, because we would just kill an awful lot of animals. And equally, again, I'm not defending government or policy, that would cost a huge amount in compensation. So
it's always been the two that I always remember, the 2 injections in the neck.
Yeah.
Avian and bovine.
But my argument is we don't need government to tell us how to control this disease. If farmers want to use bovine interpretation with their vet and cull them out, you know, when they finish their lactation or when they've reared a calf in a beef unit, we can do that. And that's the mindset shift we need to get into. We don't need to just do what government tell us to do.
That's similarly really with, isn't it?
Yeah, with pre and post movement testing. In the high risk and edge area, you don't have to post movement test. But if you never really buy animals in and you want to buy quite an expensive bull or a group of heifers, post movement test them as belt and braces. Government won't tell you to do that, but you can. And we do that sometimes for Yonis, BVD, all sorts of things.
But as you say, I think what you're saying is, you know, I know people with IRs and that's it. Once they've had it, that they won't go back in to the, you know, they'll finish their lactation or whatever it happens to be and they're gone. There's no hanging around.
And we know IRs are risky animals. I think it's something like around 12% will become future reactors.
I was just about to ask that. What's the prevalence of going from an IR to a full positive?
They are risky animals. And if in herds that have never had TB before, the warning signs for me is when people ring and say, I've never had TB before. I had an IR at my last test. I've just had 2 or 3 more IRs. That's the beginning. And we know 50% of breakdowns start with IRs. So don't ignore them. get rid of them and start to look at those bovine onlys. Can I sort of manage some of these animals out the herd, because they might be the ones that shut me down in a year's time?
So, Sarah, I'm just going to pick up on that proactive mindset. I know that sort of that sociology, is it sociology? I've got the wrong word probably. That part of it is like really interesting as to, how can we help that proactive mindset really, and really help farmers that want to go further. Have you identified anything, or what's your views on how we can do this? Or
yeah, and actually in the last sort of 7-8 years that I've been focusing on TB, my knowledge around TB probably hasn't improved, but my behavioural insights and how to achieve behaviour change, that's where I've learned an awful lot. And we do quite a bit in our TBAS training for our vets on how to get those bespoke recommendations. And my thing that I follow is making things easy, attractive, social and timely. So they've got to be easy. If you're buying animals in, let's risk score the ones you're going to buy in. You can do that with your vet. If you're putting a new shed up, put sheeted gates up, put raised water troughs in from the beginning. Attractive. So we heard earlier about a tested herd's got a financial incentive. That is making things attractive. Or the counter to that was the movement restrictions, the ones that weren't attested. So you've got the sort of sanctions. Making things social. So doing things like this, allowing people to hear about it, going on farm walks with farmers that are doing proactive things, seeing somebody like you being able to achieve it. Because quite often I do get farmers who say, well, I can't do that. And I think, well, I know farmers that are doing that. So we need to get the message out. And then timely, like I said earlier, maybe when you've just shut a farm down with TB, let's not talk about all the proactive things that they can do to reduce their breakdown. Let's help them, support them through that breakdown. But actually, when they've gone clear, a week or two later, TBAS advisors should be picking the phone up and saying, right, what do we do next? Equally, if you've got new people coming into the farm, you've got new staff coming on board, nieces, nephews, cousins, daughters, sons coming into the farm, let's use that opportunity to have a bit of a refresh, sit down, make a plan and include TB in it.
I mean, what can someone like Sarah and I, if we're on farm or at farm walk, I mean, we're not vets to advise in that way, but what can the likes of ourselves do?
I think just get people to talk about TB, because it is hard. And actually a lot of what I do through the TB advisory service telephone line, which we do have, is I'm not talking about TB biosecurity. I'm doing exactly what I've done with you guys. It's going through the basics. And I always say to farmers, as I've said on here, the one thing I'd like everybody to do is when a farmer says, I had reactors, they went for slaughter and they didn't have it, this is a waste of time, government don't know what they're doing, that actually we've empowered people to say, I'm not sure that's right, you need to speak to your vet, or if you're confident enough, repeat what I've said. And there are fact sheets and websites out there to support people to do that. So one brilliant website is the TB Hub. If it's not on there, then it's probably not worth knowing. And there's some really sort of not even farmer friendly, but just really simple fact sheets that explain exactly what I've explained about the skin test, about IRs, about the gamma test. They're all on there, so people can access them just to remind themselves, because they are the really important messages that TB control's working. It's doing what it needs to do. We do need to do more, but we are getting there.
I mean, I think sort of for myself, I've pretty much worked in the Southwest in the dairy industry, and I think I'm just heading into my 30th year now. And TB has been an issue all of that time. So I guess it's almost one of those things that you almost become complacent hearing about. And it's actually reminding yourself, actually, no, there are still things that farmers can do. And it's perhaps a little bit different in areas where, sort of TB has been around for so long versus areas that are just sort of becoming newly infected, I guess.
Yeah, and if we don't engage as an industry now, we're at risk of slipping back. So I'm a big believer, and we've got peer-reviewed science and evidence that badger culling has had an impact on TB, quite a significant impact. government policy, even pre the change of government, were looking at an exit strategy for culling, which I absolutely think is right, and so did other organisations, because we've probably culled what we needed to cull. What we now need to do is tackle those endemically infected herds, like we talked about, and actually start to think about trade. How do we identify and risk assess what we're buying in? If you're buying in cattle to finish and they're going into a shed, could you become one of these AFUs? So these are proof finishing units that are basically biosecure, so they're not going to leak TB out into the wildlife or into other cattle herds. And the reward for them is you don't have to do any routine testing. So to me, there's a win-win there. If I appreciate not all units can do that, but there is a way to think about that. Putting TB information at the point of sale. So farmers, if they want to use that information, it's there for them. We're making it easy for them. We do have the IBTB map that I spoke about earlier, but that's not something that you could use easily probably in a market situation. So we can manage risky animals in a less risky way, and we can reduce the risk from buying those animals in, just by understanding when their last TB breakdown was.
So just as a sort of straight bit of advice to a farmer that's wanting to buy some cattle from somewhere, and you've mentioned this IBTB. I see, look, I can't even, there's too many initials in the wrong order. Can you explain what a farmer needs to do to be able to find the answer?
Yeah, so the IBTB map is online. If you Google IBTB, and it comes up and it looks like Google Maps. You can zoom in and out. There's a little search bar and you can search CPH and postcode. So if you're buying privately, again, maybe at markets, if a CPH or a postcode was just added to the lots, that would make it easier. Look on there and it will tell you the number of breakdowns it's had, when they were, and importantly, when they were closed and when they were opened up, so you can tell the length of a breakdown. So, for example, farmers are allowed to use their second clearing test as a pre-movement test. So these animals come into market, they think they're infection-free because they've passed a pre-movement test, but as we know that from the moderate sensitivity of the skin test, there's a chance that we've missed infected animals. We can reduce the risk of that because the longer a herd has been testing clear, the more we can trust that clear test. So if a farm's just been shut down for 2 years, they've sold off the back of their clearing test, there's probably a high likelihood that those animals have got some infection. Equally, if they're going to go into a shed and be fattened for food, then that could be less of a risk. If they're in-calf heifers that you want to buy to breed and keep for the next 10 years, that's a bigger risk. But you could post-movement test them. You can even privately gamma test. There's all those things that you can do above and beyond government policy to reduce that risk. Farmers often say to me, well, how long TB-free is kind of the golden standard?
Yeah.
And I would say it's a risk assessment for you to sit down with your farm vet and discuss. If you've had TB in the last couple of years and you're looking for Yoni's clear animals, BVD clear animals, maybe a farm that's TB free 2 years or more is okay for your risk. If you've never had TB, the longer it is, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, then the more trust you can have in those animals.
Now, you mentioned gamma testing. I mean, we're talking about skin test, gamma testing. That's been around, 10 years must be, I would say. What can you tell us about gamma testing? How sensitive is that? Why is that brought in?
Yeah.
Tell us more about gamma testing.
Yeah, so gamma testing is more sensitive. So we've got a better chance of finding infected animals. However, the gamma test is less specific. So because farmers often say, well, if it's more sensitive, why aren't we using more gamma? Well, the problem is it is less specific. So we could find false positives. So that's why we don't use gamma as a screening test. I still believe that the skin test, even though we've been using it since the 1930s, is the right test to use as a screening test. However, the gamma test is used routinely when you've got herds that have got lesions at slaughter. Because
what triggers a gamma test?
So lesions at slaughter. So what we call an OTFW breakdown. So these are, you've got OTFS, officially TB-free status suspended. and officially TB-free status withdrawn. And there's lots of different nuances to when herds become either. But as a rule of thumb, if you have lesions at slaughter, then government will say, OK, we need to be a bit harder on the testing in this herd to try and reduce the spread within the cattle and get you clearer quicker. So the gamma test is used. You do find more animals because it is more sensitive, and the gamma test can pick up the immune response that we're testing for earlier than the skin test. So again, a lot of people say, I lose heifers, younger animals on the gamma test, and that's potentially why, because we can pick it up earlier.
But my understanding, you don't test under 6 months with a gamma test, is that right?
No, and that's because of the immune system developing. So you get more false negatives if you tested animals under 6 months, just because of the immune system.
So let's say I've gone down with TB today and you're gamma testing. We're not gamma testing anything under 6 months. Does that mean you need to come back, you or, ministry or whoever does it needs to come back and test those animals in 6 months' time?
No, they tend not to.
A pool of TB.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to policy. There's got to be a cut-off because it does cost the government £100 million every year to control it. So this is this balance that I spoke about, Ideally, as soon as you had a TB breakdown, you'd go in with gamma, and like you say, you'd repeat it. But
I say, surely you're risking those animals in 2 years' time being the source of another breakdown.
Yeah, and I guess this is where how much does government control the disease and how much do we control that disease? So it is looking at what the bovine onlys in those animals, looking at the family lines of those animals. I suppose they will go through skin testing at the least. So it is a balance, like I say, between cost and disease control. And again, I always talk about kind of COVID control when we talk about TB, because people understand, how hard that was. We all went into lockdown. We were all put under movement restrictions. However, at some point that became worse than the actual risk of the disease once we started vaccinating and levels were dropping down. So it was a balance between businesses thriving and succeeding and actually controlling an infectious disease. So it is a balance. I mean, I've been in low risk areas where TB has been brought into the area through people buying TB clear animals, but they were infected. And farmers have pointed their finger and wagged it and said, why aren't we banning cattle movements out of the southwest? Well, we know that would destroy an awful lot of businesses. So that policy isn't introduced. Maybe, hopefully, when we're at really low levels, we might, restrict movements a little bit, because that is how it could seed back into areas. But it is hard controlling a disease. What I like to say to farmers is, actually, if it wasn't notifiable, how many of you would pay to have that routine TB test? Because it is a free screening test for an infectious disease, and I think it is doing what it needs to do. And I think in the thousands of farmers that I've spoken to, about 10 have put their hand up. And it's because it's the fear of the control measures that is the impact. Why would you voluntarily test and do extra testing? So I think, that's why we don't use a lot of gamma, is I suppose what I'm coming back to.
You might have answered it and I might have missed it, but sort of how many false positives can you get under gamma? Because as you've already said, it is closely related to yonis.
So the gamma test, if you tested 100 animals that didn't have TB, or with the gamma test, you get 3 to 4 false positives. So that's quite high. However, that's the reason we don't use it as a screening test in non-infected herds.
The standard,
Once we go into an infected herd, the positive predictive value goes up. So the chances of them being false positive is a lot less, because we're already testing an infected population.
We know it's there.
Yeah. And again, it's that balance. It's that risk. Do we take out the odd false positive? But in the long term, we know we're going to stamp out the disease. So it's that balance again.
And that's, I guess, in if you're voluntarily doing it, that's up to you as to whether you want to take that hit at that point or take the risk.
You mentioned yonis just then. So they are very similar. And actually, the avian part of the comparative skin test, and yonis is Mycobacterium avian paratuberculosis. There is some thought that if you've got yonis positive animals, you actually get more false negative TB cattle, because it'll increase the avian part of the lump, which is what we're doing the comparative of.
Yep.
The flip of that, and this is quite kind of newish sort of science, is that traditionally we were told not to do the Yonis testing within 90 days of the TB test because of false positives on the Yonis, whereas actually, and this makes complete sense, if you do the TB test before the Yonis test, you can't stimulate antibodies that aren't there. So antibodies means an animal's been exposed to Yonis, and actually what we do, if you do your Yonis test after your TB test, you increase the sensitivity, the chance of an animal testing truly positive to the Yonis test. So a lot of farms now are actually timing their Yonis testing, within a couple of weeks, a month of the skin test to improve Yonis control.
See, I hadn't realised that had changed. Goes to show that there's that. Yeah. We don't always, these things don't filter through to everybody. So that's really interesting.
But you mentioned like finding lesions in the lungs. And that obviously, but where else can you find TB? Because I know I've had a client say to me, we've had a report that one of our animals had TB in the udder, and they're like, have you ever heard of that? And I said, well, I hadn't. So where else can you find TB?
Yeah, so it is a disease of the lungs and the lymph tissue. So sometimes farmers will say, it came back and it had TB in the head. What it means is the lymph nodes that sit within the sort of skull.
Right.
Udder is a common place to find it, again, because it's draining the milk into the lymph tissue. And that is how calves will pick up TB from their mother through colostrum and through shed milk. So we do know that is a way of, you can really easily infect a cohort of calves, because that cow that's got a cell count, so you're not putting her in the tank, you use her milk to feed the calves, her cell count could be because actually she's got TB, and you've just infected that whole next generation of calves. And that's why we routinely say, pasteurization of colostrum, only give mothers colostrum, or even now a lot of people are using artificial colostrum.
So effectively in the same route as
Yonis.
Yonis.
Yeah.
As soon as you said it, I was thinking, should we be pasteurising our colostrum then in that case?
Yeah, and I think this is where government are trying to be a bit joined up at putting things like pasteurisation units on the technology and grants and things like that, because that's a way of supporting farmers to manage these diseases.
I mean, can a cow develop its own antibodies to TB?
So interestingly enough, that what the skin test and the gamma test are testing isn't antibodies. And we traditionally think that antibodies don't rise till quite late in TB. So once the lesions sort of start to get bigger and time goes longer,
they're fighting it longer and harder.
The immune system, the hypersensitivity reaction that we're testing with the FCN and the gamma starts to fade, but antibodies start to rise. And that's why you do get the farmer who'll say, gosh, this cow's been through, 10 TB tests in her lifetime, but when I sent her as a cull, she was riddled with lesions. And that's because the skin test becomes even less sensitive. And so there are antibody tests out there now that have been developed. There's one called the IDEX test, which is DEFRA approved. So that can be used in persistently infected herds, persistent breakdowns, where we think we might have these anergic cows, we call them, that aren't responding to the skin or the gamma test. There's another one that is validated through WOA, and that's the Enfaplex test.
WOA?
The World Organization for Animal Health. Used to be the IOE. The OIE, sorry, and it changed its name. So that's the sort of process that any test that wants to go to market, you sort of submit your dossier of all the experiments and tests you've done. It's the Enfaplex test isn't DEFRA approved, so it can't be used as part of a government sort of testing schedule. However, you can apply to use that privately. So again, it's a way of farmers thinking, well, I would like to use these more sensitive tests because the antibody tests tend to be more sensitive. The other school of thought is, we now know with Yonis again, that actually if a heifer has a bit of a spike on her Yonis milk test in first lactation, we shouldn't ignore that, because we know actually animals get infected with Yonis in their first month, 6 months of life. And so you can see that spike, and then she'll be fine for 2 or 3 lactations, and then she'll start to rise up. Well, actually, we shouldn't be keeping replacements off her. We shouldn't ignore that. And that's exactly the same as we think now, maybe with TB. Should we be going in earlier with some of these antibody tests? Maybe antibodies do similar to Yonis. And that's I think that's the science and evidence we need to be getting to allow farmers to make these more informed decisions on farm.
So watch this space for some more trial work.
Yeah.
So we've sort of talked about where it came from, talked about the skin test, talked about the gamma test. Let's talk about it. So if you haven't got TB or are not in a TB area, what would your advice be to farmers?
Good biosecurity. And that word puts people off. It makes people yawn. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about infectious disease control. It's not just, it's what's your risk of an infection coming onto the farm. So that's what people traditionally think about biosecurity, is having clean trailers, no nose-to-nose contact with your neighbours, where's your water courses coming from, be careful from purchases. And it's not just purchases, it's heifers that are reared away from home or cattle that graze different pastures off farm through summer. That's what sort of that biosecurity, but also thinking about once you're in the farmyard, where have your staff been? Just if you have got or had TB in the past, where are those high risk animals, and can we put things in place to stop the sort of spread once we're on farm? So, and a lot of the biosecurity measures that we should be doing much better as a ruminant industry will
compared to the likes of pigs,
will absolutely reduce the risk of TB and other infectious diseases.
It's back to basics, isn't it? Which
absolutely
is really, it's quite sad that as a dairy industry we don't take it as seriously as pig and poultry. Yeah. And I think it could make such a big difference to not just TB, but as you say, all those other infectious diseases.
Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of a story. I went on farm a number of years ago now and saw the foot bath, dipped my feet.
Yeah.
If ever I see one, I'll do it. Anyway, farmer comes out. He said, I've been watching you from my kitchen. I'm like, right. He said, you're the first person I've ever seen actually go and use that foot bath.
Yeah. And how many people, when you're at markets and they've got the sort of mats out now that people have to walk over, they're sort of tiptoeing around the edge because they've got their nice suede loafers on instead of the sort of boots, or they even turn up and they've got visibly dirty boots and shoes. Somebody said to me the other day in one of our sort of teams at work, said, but we don't tell people why. We assume people know why we're asking them to dip their boots. So her idea was we should get some boards printed with, I'm asking you to dip your boots because 1 gram of feces can contain this much Yonis, BVD, and actually I would like you to dip your boots to protect my animals, which sounds really noddy, but actually sometimes, especially people that aren't necessarily involved in agriculture, think of the delivery people that we get coming up our drives, all the time, the postman, anybody like that, we should be managing that risk because they're going from farm to farm to farm to farm.
Well, I know one farm locally that's got a spray that you go through, and I was warned before I got there, forgot about it, had my windows open, spray.
So you got sprayed too.
Yes.
But it's actually thinking about how long those diseases can stay in that slurry, because I think that's sort of one of the Yonis things, isn't it? Is it 6 months or something that the Yonis can stay in the slurry? So we think, it's all right, it's only dirty overalls, but actually...
And one of the things with TB that we talk about in the TB advisory service is actually how do we manage the risk of TB from slurry? There has been some science done that has found slurry in TB in the muck of reactors that have gone into the slaughterhouse. It's written up really nicely on the TB hub. It's probably one of the lower risks for TB, cattle to cattle and potentially infected badger to cattle and vice versa are the biggest risks. But if you are, some people do import slurry from other farms, I believe. Probably other infectious diseases are a bigger risk than TB, or a lot of people now are using much more precision techniques. That possibly means a very big piece of kit that's expensive. So you use a contractor. Where's that contractor been before they came to your farm? And interesting enough, there was a contractor that was at a talk I did on Wednesday night who said, well, what should I do? What can I do to reduce the risk? I can't wash everything through because that'd be a day out of my work. And I said, as long as you're visibly clean, like you've just said with the spray, no organic matter. And also when you go on the farm, the first load goes onto the least risky ground, so your arable ground. Then you put it onto your mowing grass, then you put it onto your grazing. So it's washed out the other person's muck with your own. So your own is safer, I suppose, than someone else's.
So we talked about non-TB. What advice would you give somebody? I know how long's a piece of string, but someone that sort of either got it or somewhere like here in the southwest where it is just everywhere.
Yeah, so my tip is that you have to have TB for your slurry to potentially be infected, and then just like we've just said, manage it. The more precision techniques you can use to apply it, so injecting straight into the ground, obviously it's in the soil, so you're not contaminating your grass. Then trailing shoes, dribble bars, they're going again onto the soil, not onto the grass. Splash plating is the worst way or the easiest way to spread TB and other infectious disease, because it actually can produce aerosols that can travel, 1-2 kilometres into sort of potentially other people's land. So, but I think things like splash plating are being phased out.
I was going to say what's best practice for TB control is also best practice for
everything,
for the environment and everything else. It's good. It all fits together.
Yeah.
But aside from the contracting, what advice would you give somebody here, like in the southwest? Exactly.
Put it onto your least risky ground. Leave it as long as possible before you do graze it. DEFRA APHA would advise minimum 60 days, and storing slurry for as long as possible. So 6 months is the kind of, again, the ideal, but as long as possible. But I appreciate that not everyone's got 2 slurry tanks and they're not filling one, storing it for 6 months. It's constantly being added to. So that is harder to manage, but it's sitting down with your advisor and saying, what can I do? What can I do to reduce my risk? And some people might be able to do a lot more than others, but my motto is control the controllable. Worry about the things you can change and do it, and don't overly stress and worry about the things that are out of your control.
So for those people in England, the TB advisory service gives that opportunity for the vet to come on farm free of charge?
Yes, absolutely. It's totally free at the point of the farmer. It's a couple of hours depending on how much you get talking. Mine normally last quite a lot longer because we get talking. And we do offer free badger set surveys as well. So if you do think you are concerned about the badger risk, or in the low risk area, cattle seeding TB into the badger population, so reducing badger cattle interaction is important for that too, we can do badger set surveys as well. We've trained vets to do that. And we do have the telephone advice line. So we have a group of people on the end of the phone who can give basic biosecurity advice, like we've just said, how long should I store my slurry? How do I find the IBTB map? We can give that advice over the phone.
Okay, well, I'm just sort of looking at the time and thinking we've already had an hour. But I mean, as I'd usually say, what last words of wisdom do you have, Sarah, for people to take away from this? You said earlier, the one thing, but what really want people to take away from this today?
That government on their own and DEFRA can't control this disease. As an industry, we need to play our part. And I think we can see quite well with Yoni's control, just identifying positive animals and culling them doesn't eradicate Yonis from a farm. We need to turn the tap off, to quote Peter Orpin. We need to find those high risk animals and reduce the risk from those, whether that's through trade or within our own herd. So control the controllable, do what you can do, and use the TB advisory service to do that. But as an industry, we need to think about what's our role in TB control and what can we do out with the government.
And how do people contact the TB advisory service if they're not sure?
So we have a telephone number, 01306 779 410. We've got a website, tbas.org.uk, and there's a contact form on there. Or we're on Instagram, Facebook, and X. So you can message us on there.
Okie dokie. Well, Sarah Bolt, this time, what what would you like to say as we close today?
The other Sarah. So I think it's really interesting how Sarah talks about TB as just another infectious disease. And I think that the more we think about it like that, the more perhaps we can do to control it. And I think it's just, again, picking up on that mindset change, perhaps thinking about it as that infectious disease helps us to then work out what else we can do. So,
yeah, I mean, I like to say thank you. I've definitely learned some things from today. And I'm hoping people listening to this will as well. And if they want any more advice, contact somebody from TBAS to come and give them some advice to help them through the next step. I mean, okay, we're talking about the practical things, but also I'd say, if you are struggling emotionally from all of this, reach out to somebody like FCN, your friends, your family, because this has an impact on people. And I think people outside the industry don't realize it in quite the same way. Oh, it's just a cow. But for a lot of people, it's their livelihood. And these cows are part of the family almost.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. At the end of this, we should highlight that there is help out there for people, because, I do speak to regularly farmers that are, at their end of how they think about TB. And so people aren't on their own. But the positive news is we are winning. We are winning.
Say it sounds like it from what you've said to us earlier. So on that note, I'd like to say a thank you very much to both of you for today, and thank you for listening, those that are. So I guess it's a goodbye from me.
It's a goodbye from me too.
And bye-bye, and thank you so much for letting me talk about TB and getting the message out there wider.
You're more than welcome. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Chewing the Cud podcast, a podcast of the UK dairy industry brought to you from the southwest of England and listened to around the world. And now for the really boring bit, I'm afraid, the legal disclaimer. The information provided during this podcast has been prepared for general information purposes only and does not constitute advice. The information must not be relied upon for any purpose, and no representation or warranty is given to its accuracy, completeness, or otherwise. Any reference to other organisations, businesses or products during this podcast are not endorsements or recommendations of Chewing the Cud Limited. The views of Andrew Jones are personal and may not be the views of Chewing the Cud Limited, and the views of Sarah Bolt are personal and may not be the views of Kingsafe Farming and Conservation Limited and any affiliated companies. For more information on the podcast and details of services offered by Chewing the Cud Limited, visit www.chewingthecud.com. Thank you and goodbye.